There are wars you can lose on the battlefield, and wars you can lose long before the bullets, when the people fighting on the same side stop trusting each other. In 1944 and 1945, the Allied victory over Nazi Germany was never just a matter of tanks, ships, and aircraft. It was also a fragile political invention, a coalition held together by ego management, competing national pride, and commanders who often disliked one another more than they admitted. And at the centre of that tension stood Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, brilliant to some, unbearable to others, whose confidence could stiffen an army's spine, but could also fracture a partnership. Because Montgomery didn't simply fight the Germans, he fought for control of the narrative, for priority of resources, and for the right to define what victory should look like. To his admirers, he was the man who restored British morale and brought order to chaos. To his critics, he was a commander who demanded credit, deflected blame, and treated allies like subordinates. The central question of this story is not whether Montgomery could win battles, he often did, but whether his way of winning nearly broke the very alliance that made victory possible. And if that sounds like exaggeration, consider this. At key moments, American commanders questioned whether they could continue under his influence. British pride collided with American power, and Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, found himself fighting a second war behind closed doors, not against Hitler, but against the slow poisoning of Allied unity. Montgomery's weapon was confidence, and it cut both ways. Montgomery understood something many commanders never fully grasp. Wars are fought as much in the mind as in the mud. He cultivated certainty like a weapon, deliberate, public, and absolute, because he believed morale was a form of firepower, and a soldier who trusts his commander can endure almost anything. But that same certainty, sharpened into personal authority, created a dangerous side effect inside a coalition. In a national army, a commander can be a tyrant of method. In an alliance, that same habit becomes a political insult. Montgomery spoke with the tone of a man who expected obedience, not partnership, and he often framed complex campaigns as if there were only two categories of people, those who saw the war as he did and those who didn't yet understand it. He believed in careful preparation, overwhelming force, and tightly controlled advances, and those instincts saved lives and prevented reckless waste. Yet his method required resources, time, and priority, and every demand for one front meant another front waited. That was the spark. Americans increasingly saw him as slow and self-promoting. The British increasingly saw the Americans as impatient and wasteful. Montgomery didn't create those national differences, but he became the symbol through which they collided, until strategy meetings began to feel less like planning sessions and more like trials, where every map came with an accusation. North Africa, the rise of a general who wouldn't bend. To understand why Montgomery later became such a strain on Allied unity, you have to start where his legend hardens, North Africa, 1942–43. When Britain needed not just victory, but a commander who looked and sounded like victory. Taking command of the 8th Army before El Alamein, Montgomery imposed discipline with almost theatrical clarity. He simplified objectives, tightened planning, and projected certainty to the press and to his troops, making it unmistakable that retreat was no longer part of the vocabulary. The victory at El Alamein and the long pursuit across Libya helped turn him into a public symbol. The man who stopped Rommel, and symbols, once created, are difficult to control. Montgomery began to speak as if he embodied a particular way of war, methodical, set-piece, carefully resourced, with no appetite for improvisation that might risk catastrophe. In military terms, that caution had logic. In coalition terms, it created a problem because success gave him leverage, and leverage became expectation. As American forces entered the Mediterranean theatre, commanders with their own reputations, Eisenhower coordinating, Patton charging, Bradley learning under pressure, were suddenly operating alongside a British field marshal who was already treated like a national icon. And icons don't negotiate easily because compromise feels, to them, like surrender. North Africa didn't just elevate Montgomery, it trained him to believe that confidence, displayed loudly enough, could shape reality. Sicily and Italy, success, credit, and the first deep fractures. By the time the Allies moved into Sicily in 1943, the coalition had grown more powerful and far more sensitive. Sicily was not only a campaign, it was a rehearsal for how Britain and America would share glory, explain setbacks, and compete for influence. Montgomery's Eighth Army advanced on the island with his usual preference for control and weight of force, while American commanders, Patton in particular, were far more willing to seize openings and turn movement into momentum. The result was military progress, but political irritation. Montgomery's headquarters often spoke as if the British Axis was the main effort and everything else was support, while American leaders bristled at being treated like auxiliaries in a war they were increasingly bankrolling. Then came Italy, with its brutal terrain and slow, grinding advances. Exactly the kind of campaign where arguments over resources and priority become personal. Every delay looked like someone else's fault. Every success raised the question of who deserved the credit. Montgomery, already accustomed to a public narrative that centered him, did not retreat gracefully into the background, and his blunt style, confident in private, confident in public, made it easier for partners to interpret his decisions as judgments on their competence. These were the early fractures, not yet a break, but the sound of stress inside the structure. And once a coalition begins keeping score, who got the supplies, who got the headlines, who got the praise, it becomes harder to remember that the enemy is not the person across the table, but the army across the front. Normandy, the plan, the promises, and the pressure cooker. Normandy, in June 1944, was where Montgomery's strengths and faults became impossible to separate, because he wasn't just commanding troops. He was defending a plan, a reputation, and an alliance under the brightest spotlight of the war. As the senior ground commander for the opening phase of Operation Overlord, Montgomery's concept depended on seizing a lodgment, building combat power ashore, and then using the British and Canadian armies on the eastern flank to engage and pin Germany's armoured reserves, especially around the city of Caen, while the Americans expanded in the west and prepared for a breakout. On paper, it was coherent. In practice, it became a furnace. Caen did not fall on D-Day, and the fighting in the bocage turned every mile into a casualty list and every delay into a political argument. Montgomery insisted the struggle around Caen was not failure, but function, that his forces were absorbing the enemy's best formations and preventing them from crushing the beachhead or shifting west to smash the Americans. But many American commanders heard something else. A commander explaining slow progress while continuing to demand resources, priority, and patience. The deeper problem was expectation, because Montgomery had sold confidence so effectively that when reality became messy, confidence sounded like spin. Meetings grew sharper, interpretations of the plan diverged, and while German artillery and counterattacks hammered the front, Allied trust was being hammered too, because in a coalition, once partners suspect they are being used to make someone else's strategy look brilliant, the map table becomes as dangerous as the battlefield. Patton, Bradley, and the War of Tempers. If Montgomery was the Allied commander most skilled at controlling a narrative, George S. Patton was the one most skilled at detonating one, and Omar Bradley, calmer, steadier, often found himself trapped between them as the Americans' fortunes rose in the summer of 1944. After the breakout from Normandy and the rapid advance across France, American armies began moving with a speed and scale that changed the balance inside the alliance. The United States was no longer the junior partner learning war, it was the main engine driving it. That shift made Montgomery's tone, already firm, sound to many Americans, like arrogance refusing to accept new realities. Patton wanted fuel, freedom, and glory. Bradley wanted a broad front advance with clear logistics. Montgomery wanted a concentrated thrust with priority of supplies and the authority to shape the main effort. Those were not just strategic disagreements. They were clashes of identity. Patton and Montgomery also represented two different myths the alliance told about itself. The American myth of speed and boldness versus the British myth of method and control. In private diaries and conversations, irritation hardened into contempt, and once contempt enters a command relationship, every decision is interpreted as a provocation. Eisenhower's challenge was no longer simply coordinating armies. It was preventing a strategic debate from becoming a personal feud so intense that cooperation collapses. And that feud was moving toward its most explosive moment, because Montgomery was about to demand a gamble that required the alliance to trust him completely. Market Garden, the gamble that shocked the partnership. In September 1944, with Paris liberated and Germany seemingly reeling, Montgomery pushed for a bold shortcut to end the war, an operation so ambitious that it demanded the alliance stop debating and simply believe. His argument was seductive. Instead of grinding forward on a wide front while supplies ran thin, concentrate resources for one decisive thrust, seize a chain of bridges in the Netherlands with airborne forces, drive a single armoured corridor straight to the Rhine, and crack open Germany's industrial heartland. Market would drop paratroopers to capture the crossings. Garden would send British XXX Corps racing up the narrow highway to relieve them. It was a plan built on speed, timing, and perfect coordination, three things war rarely grants in full. American airborne divisions fought with ferocity to hold key bridges and roads. British and Polish airborne troops were thrown into an increasingly desperate battle around Arnhem, and the ground advance, forced to funnel through a single elevated road, became a traffic jam under fire, vulnerable to ambush, blown bridges, and counterattacks. The deeper issue wasn't simply that Market Garden failed to reach its final objective. It was that the failure landed like a political explosion. Americans saw a risky, high-profile gamble that consumed priority supplies and still could not deliver the promised breakthrough. The British saw an operation that came painfully close and might have succeeded with just a little more luck, a little more speed, a little more support. Montgomery, who had sold the plan as the war-winning stroke, now faced the brutal mathematics of consequence. When you ask allies to bet everything on your judgment, you don't just risk men, you risk trust. And after Arnhem, trust was thinner than ever, because the coalition wasn't arguing about a bridge anymore. It was arguing about whether one commander's certainty had become a danger to the entire Allied strategy. Winter 1944. The words that nearly lit the match. By December 1944, the alliance was already bruised from Market Garden, and then the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, hit like a sledgehammer, not only testing Allied lines, but exposing how fragile Allied pride had become. In the first chaotic days, German forces ruptured the American front, communications snapped, and the map table filled with emergencies, exactly the kind of moment when egos either disappear for the mission or erupt. Eisenhower made a cold, practical decision. To stabilize the northern shoulder of the crisis, he temporarily placed the US 1st and 9th Armies under Montgomery's coordination, because Montgomery's headquarters was positioned to manage the defense while American command structures regrouped. Militarily, it was sensible. Politically, it was gasoline. Many Americans accepted the necessity, but they did not accept the symbolism, because it looked on paper like an American army being saved by the man many already considered insufferable. And then came the moment that turned tension into fury. Montgomery's public messaging, delivered with his familiar confidence, implied a story of rescue and control, of Montgomery arriving to restore order, at a time when American units were bleeding, holding and counter-attacking with extraordinary courage. To American commanders, it sounded like credit-taking in the middle of a crisis. To the British, it sounded like leadership. But inside the alliance, perception was reality, and by early 1945, some of the sharpest voices in the American command were no longer simply arguing with Montgomery's strategy. They were questioning whether the alliance could function if he kept speaking like the war belonged to him. Eisenhower's quiet battle to hold the team together. If Montgomery nearly broke the Allies, it was because the alliance depended on a commander who could do something rarer than winning battles, making rivals accept one another long enough to finish the war. That commander was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and his greatest victories were often invisible, won in rooms where no bullets flew, only words. Eisenhower understood that coalition warfare is a constant negotiation between national pride and military necessity, and that the wrong tone can destroy cooperation faster than any German counterattack. He also understood Montgomery's value. Monty could plan carefully, defend stubbornly, and maintain discipline under pressure. But Eisenhower understood his cost, too. Montgomery's need to be right, to be seen as right, and to have his way could infect the command climate like a slow fever. So Eisenhower did what supreme commanders must do. He absorbed resentment from both sides while refusing to let the argument become a fracture. He managed Montgomery with firmness and restraint, praising him when useful, correcting him when necessary, and when the alliance threatened to split, using the one currency that could still buy unity: authority backed by results. At the same time, Eisenhower had to reassure American commanders that partnership did not mean humiliation, and reassure the British that American power would not erase British influence. In other words, he fought a balancing act so delicate that any public misstep, any perceived insult, any careless claim of credit could have turned strategy into a political crisis. The front line ran through France and Belgium, but the fault line ran through Allied headquarters, and Eisenhower's job was to stop it from opening. The verdict, what the record shows, Monty got right, and what he risked. The fairest verdict on Montgomery is also the most uncomfortable. He was often strategically rational and still politically corrosive. His defenders point to what the battlefield record suggests. His insistence on preparation reduced unnecessary disasters. His caution avoided reckless overextension, and in moments like the northern shoulder of the bulge, he provided stable coordination when stability mattered. His critics point to an equally real record. He repeatedly overpromised, shaped public narratives to protect his image, and treated coalition partners with a tone that turned strategic debate into personal insult. After Market Garden, the core problem wasn't merely a failed operation, it was the gap between Montgomery's certainty and the war's reality, because the wider that gap became, the more his allies suspected manipulation rather than leadership. Historians and after-action discussions tend to converge on this. Montgomery did not almost break the Allies by sabotaging victory. He did it by making unity feel optional, by acting as if agreement was something allies should grant him rather than something he had to earn. In a national army, that might still work. In a coalition, it's dangerous, because even a great plan becomes unusable if partners refuse to trust the planner. And by 1945, trust had become one of the rarest resources on the Western Front. The lesson, winning the war, also meant winning the alliance. So when people ask why Montgomery almost broke the Allies, the answer isn't that he lacked talent. It's that he carried talent like a weapon pointed in too many directions. He could stiffen resolve, impose order, and demand standards that saved lives, but he could also turn cooperation into competition and strategy into a struggle for credit and control. The Allies ultimately defeated Germany because their material power was overwhelming, their operational learning was relentless, and commanders like Eisenhower kept the coalition from tearing itself apart when egos threatened to do what the Wehrmacht could not. That is the quiet truth at the heart of this story. The alliance survived not because everyone agreed, but because enough leaders understood that unity was a battlefield of its own. And that brings us back to where we began, the war that could be lost before the bullets. Montgomery didn't break the Allies in two, but there were moments when he pulled the seams so tight that victory itself could have become a political fracture. The lesson is simple and brutal. In coalition war, you don't just win by being right, You win by keeping partners willing to fight beside you, even when you're not.